Okay, today I'm going to talk about something it's got to be said again, and that is this conversation about back pressure on an internal combustion engine, 4-stroke engine, okay? I'm talking about a dirt bike, 2-stroke. I'm talking about cars, trucks, things that people drive in 2021. Modern day stuff. So right off the top, you do not need back pressure. You don't need it. It's not something that you want. It may be something that you have. Inevitably, there's going to be some sort of opposing force, equal and opposite reaction, physics, 9th grade, okay? There will be some level of back pressure, or some opposition, or something that is inhibiting or slowing down the flow of your exhaust. However, you don't want any of that. So what I've done is I've went out onto YouTube, because there are 5, 6 videos, probably more, that are from quality sources that explain the engineering and explain how it works. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take excerpts of these videos and I'm going to play them for you to see, to hit the highlights of the things, basically going to contradict the things or disprove the things that people on the internet like to say. And as I was doing this, I found a video that I had never seen before, and I'm not sure how old it is, but some of these videos are 5 and 6 years old. So there's no excuse for anyone who's going to comment or profess, explain to someone, or make a comment as if you know what the heck you're talking about. There's no reason for people to not know this information, because if you don't know what you're talking about, keep your freaking holes shut. Because if you did know what you were talking about, you wouldn't be saying what you're saying. So let's just go ahead and get into this right now. Start with the first video right here.
Anyone who spent time on forums or the comments section has undoubtedly read the classic warning of a larger exhaust hurting low-end torque due to a decrease in back pressure. Back pressure is simply the pressure opposing the desired exhaust flow. So where does this myth regarding low-end torque come from, and does it hold any truth? First, it's important to understand a few basic terms regarding exhaust gases. Exhaust velocity. This is essentially how quickly the gases move through the exhaust. To an extent, a smaller pipe will increase exhaust velocity, and a larger pipe will decrease exhaust velocity. Turbulence. Simply the inefficient tumbling of gases. Exhaust scavenging. This refers to the effect of negative pressures that follow each exhaust pulse sent out by individual cylinders. The vacuum behind each pulse can essentially pull the next exhaust pulse along, making the exhaust system work more effectively. So where does this myth come from? When a larger exhaust system is installed, exhaust velocity can be decreased, turbulence can rear its ugly head, and the effect of exhaust scavenging can be diminished, all causing a loss of power, mainly at low RPMs. As revs increase and more gas flows, these problems aren't as noticeable. This isn't to say that any increase in exhaust diameter will cause this, especially if the system is set up and tuned correctly for the engine. To put it simply, exhaust velocity and scavenging are much more vital to making good power than the amount of back pressure.
Richard Waitis, I'm the senior manager and spokesperson at MagnaFlow Performance Exhaust. Well, an exhaust system really only has one primary function, and that's to evacuate exhaust from the cylinder head post-combustion and getting it away from What you're looking at is how to get those exhaust gases out from the cylinder head and pass through to get to the end portion, whichever is going to be your tailpipe for the purpose of evacuation, but doing so in the most efficient means possible. We design that header or manifold. We want to make sure that we're not creating a restriction by allowing for too little exhaust gas exit. And we don't want to create a disturbance of laminar flow either. Oftentimes we want to create an immediate turn as it comes outside of the cylinder head, but what we found through testing is that if we can create a straight exit off the cylinder port and then create a more gentle bend, you'll get better exhaust flow through the entire exhaust system. That first bend is usually a function of fitment. Take a dragster, for example, with those long zoomies out the side. They have very small port angles and a very long straight tube that comes out. And the car is actually physically designed around optimal exhaust. Now, in most cars that we're working with, we've got a car that's got packaging where the exhaust can't simply exit the engine compartment right where the port is. So now we're introducing our first restriction, which will be that first bend. One of the most critical things on design for the exhaust system is picking out your primary tube diameter. Now, this is a function of simple, how many CFM do we have coming out of the motor at peak exhaust valve lift? Once we know that CFM, we can appropriately pick the right size diameter. If we go too large and it's not going to promote good flow from the port, we can actually create a restriction right there at the port. If we go too small, same problem. We can actually neck it down, and now we're going to create another pressure outside the port, creating more restriction for that exhaust exiting that cylinder head. Say our port exit point has a diameter of X, and we want to go X plus maybe 1/8 of an inch. If we take that 1/8 of an inch larger volume, what we're doing though is we're creating a small expansion point. And as we know, as that exhaust gas comes out and starts to expand, we're slowing it down. So now that gas is traveling at a lower speed as it travels through the rest of the exhaust system, which means as it passes through all the rest of those components, it's going to continue slowing down. Picking that proper tubing size so that transition is almost seamless will cause an effect that keeps the exhaust gas velocity high and delivers the exhaust out with the most efficiency out the tailpipe. The world has got a lot of technical components to it. Understanding how those components interact will hopefully let you make a better choice in selecting the best design for exhaust that you need for your car.
Engines need back pressure to run. It's the exact opposite. Now, this, like I said, this is an old wives' tale. This goes back to when I was a little kid, and the old timers would all be like, "Oh, an engine needs back pressure." Knowledgeable about how camshaft events affect the way an engine runs, you would just say, "Oh, well, it needs back pressure," right? But no, what it actually needs is a scavenging / vacuum system. So let me explain, right? So every engine you're going to come across has got some degree of overlap ground into the camshaft. So overlap is when both the intake and the exhaust valves are open at the same time. So low performance engines, regular passenger car engines, have a small amount of overlap. Higher performance engines have a large amount of overlap. And generally that's where the lumpity lump comes from, the camshaft. So the reason that overlap is there is that when the piston is at top dead center, before it starts on its way down. Now this is at the top of the exhaust stroke. So you got to picture this now, right? The exhaust valve is closing. The intake valve is just starting to open. The piston is at top dead center and about to start coming down and drawing the intake charge in. During that period of overlap, the vacuum supplied by the exhaust system is used to start the mixture, the intake mixture, coming into the chamber, into the cylinder. So basically what will happen is if you start, let's say you start your engine and it's got nothing, just naked exhaust ports, right? There's no vacuum pulse to help pull that mixture through. And so you don't get full cylinder filling. Obviously you'll get some because the piston coming down is creating vacuum. But the charge doesn't really have a head start on it. So you'll get maybe, you're just talking like round numbers, you'll get like 3/4 of a cylinder full instead of a full cylinder full. So it's like even an exhaust manifold. So you look at this and you say, well, this is all kinds of restrictive, right? This is going to cause back pressure. Well, it does to an extent. You don't want any back pressure at all. This will give you a little back pressure because the cylinders are all batch firing basically into this lock. But because they end up in a collector, which is, just the outlet and the head pipe, right? There's a vacuum that's formed over here. And since you've got 4 cylinders firing into this one opening, the vacuum here is going to be greater than the pressure in any given part of the manifold. So here's where your vacuum happens. And as the vacuum is happening, as the exhaust pulse is heading down the pipe, it's sucking along here and it's pulling against each of the ports. And that works with that overlap period to get the mixture going. And then of course you go to the next step, which would represent even less, quote, back pressure, and that's the header. And in this case, now the pulse each individual exhaust pulse has its own evacuation system, and it's pulling that intake through, and then you've got the collector combining to keep basically the balance between the cylinders even, so that everything is pulling through evenly, and you're getting optimum cylinder fill and optimum horsepower. So it's like, there's the myth. There is no benefit to back pressure ever under any circumstances. Get that thought out of your mind. You want a free-flowing exhaust system that optimizes the scavenging effect. It can also be confused with, people will put too big an exhaust system on the car, and power will fall off. And it's not that the smaller system creates more back pressure, but the smaller system creates a velocity that's more in tune with the engine's breathing characteristics.
My name's Matt, welcome back to the shop, and today we're talking about this back pressure, this supposed 4-stroke back pressure. Does it exist, doesn't exist? People say it does, people say it doesn't, all the rest of it. So I have to you have a word, some kind of context. So the context we're going to use for this to make it easier to explain without going balls deep into valve timing and all the rest of it yet, because those videos are coming and I need to cut out loads of stencils and stuff so I can show you how everything works and moves and what have you. But we're going to talk about aftermarket exhausts and how that has anything to do with this back pressure or not. So it's actually split down into a couple of stages, so we'll go into the stages first. So the first stage is what actually happens in your engine itself. So you'll have a combustion chamber, and you'll have a piston, and you'll have some valves, and what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the exhaust stroke, because obviously this is exhaust and all the rest of it. And what happens is obviously your piston comes up on the exhaust stroke and it pushes out all these gases. However, your piston is going to get to here. As you should all know now, we call this top dead centre, and as you can see there is a volume in here that hasn't been evacuated. Even your pistons don't squish down to nothing, so as all your exhaust gases and all the rest of it get pushed out of your exhaust valve through your exhaust port like this, they all get pushed out. There is going to be an equilibrium at some point, and there is going to be a volume, usually lower than but near enough close to your compressive volume. So if you have just say a 500cc one-cylinder engine and you have a 10:1 compression ratio, then there is going to be 50cc of exhaust gases left in there. Usually it's smaller than that because the flow, as it's been forced, it gains momentum and it starts rushing out and all the rest of it. And this isn't good. This isn't good for performance. Because just say if it is a 10:1, then 10% or just a bit less than 10% of your cylinder, your entire volume, your total volume, is exhaust gases, and exhaust gases don't combust. Not only that, is exhaust gases can actually do two things. They can be the cause of pre-ignition if they linger around and things are bad in there anyway, but not only that is they can kind of dampen combustion, because it's basically dampening the amount of oxygen in there. And you can use this is all about exhaust gas recirculation and all the rest of it. So this is bad. At the end of the day, we're trying to fill a 500cc cylinder with 500cc's, and 10% of it is being robbed by the fact that we can't get it out. So what do? Well, we do valve overlap. So just as the piston's coming up and just as we're about to close the exhaust valve, we open, get rid of that, we open the inlet valve. Now that might seem like madness, but we open the inlet valve, and what happens there is we have a direction of flow. So this piston's come up and everything's starting to migrate this way out of the port, and then obviously when we open this valve, fresh fuel mixture comes in and it pushes this 50cc for a 500cc cylinder, oops, backwards brackets like an idiot, it pushes out the rest. It's purging, basically, that's the best word for it. It is purging the cylinder and pushing out all these exhaust gases. Great. And you have to be careful, especially when you're considering emissions testing and all the rest of it, because what's going to happen to this, if the duration of the overlap is too great, then obviously you're going to have fuel and air piss into here, fresh charge piss into your exhaust pipe. So what you do is you close it down back before that. Now one of the big problems is obviously that all engines have variable RPM, so what works at 1 RPM doesn't work for the rest of it. They've generally got to choose an RPM at which this door shuts in its face at the right time, and they choose it in the power band just like you do with everything else. That's kind of the standard way of doing it. Where does the exhaust pipe come into all this? Well, that's stage 2. So generally what happens is with our system here, we have our exhaust port, and then at the end of it we have an end can, like so, and in between that we have an exhaust, like so. So we have our valve and our exhaust, and this exhaust is obviously full of gases. It always is. If it's lower pressure in here, then it'll suck air from in outside in the back tailpipe, if that ever did happen, and out stupid like that. Basically what happens is the flow rate, the rate at which the inlet comes in, the speed at which that comes in and pushes out this exhaust gases, is very dependent on the pressure in the exhaust pipe. And this is where this back pressure thing comes from, this talking about back pressure. Because just for argument's sake, let's say our baffles in our exhaust, which are there to basically suppress noise, is the rate at which these exhaust gases and the rate at which this entire, it's kind of like a cross flow system where the intake is coming in and pushing out, the rate at which that the speed at which that flow travels at is dependent on what the pressure is in this exhaust pipe. So these gases initially, when the when the piston's at the bottom and this exhaust valve opens and the piston starts to push up, all these gases in this cylinder, 500 cc's worth, we go back to what we had, gets pushed into our exhaust, and it basically creates a pressure in this exhaust. Now as soon as we get to these baffles, that causes the flow to slow down because it has to do this fucking maze. Now yes, baffles generally aren't like literally baffles in a fuel tank, I get that. This is just easy to draw and gives you a demonstration. This is the flow to slow down, which means there's a car pile up in your exhaust, which means your pressure increases a bit. And that pressure in this exhaust is what controls not controls, but it's what limits the speed of this cross flow going on. So all is good, and the whole thing has been designed to basically, purge the cylinder as much as possible, but also to be within the standards of emissions. So what happens when you have an aftermarket exhaust? So how do aftermarket exhausts make more power? With an aftermarket exhaust, basically, in a nutshell, you're doing this. You're just wiping out the baffles. You're wiping out this entire easier flowing exhaust. So what happens is now, when the piston's at the bottom, it starts to push up, the exhaust gases can quite easily just flow out to the outside world. And they increase in speed because there isn't this resistance, there isn't this crystal maze fucking jobby resistance, this back pressure. So the exhaust gases fly out, which means that the pressure inside this exhaust pipe actually drops. It drops down, the pressure is lower. So when you open your intake valve for your cross flowing, for your overlap, for your purge, then the intake gases can whoosh in and then they can whoosh literally straight out. So you end up with having about, possibly 5% of your 500cc of fresh charge in your exhaust pipe. Basically, why does it create more power is because when you have one of these aftermarket exhausts that's almost like a flow through, there's basically fuck all to it, you will get more power for the simple fact is you've done a complete purge. Instead of being there that 3%, like I said, about 3% left in there remaining, instead you'll have 0. So this entire 500cc cylinder will be fuel and air. You're just pissing and wasting some fuel and air out your exhaust pipe. So this is why you do see high numbers. This is why they're not really that much high, maybe maximum 5% or something like that. But it's just removing this restriction in your exhaust. And I don't like to say the word restriction so much because people think, oh, it's restricted. It's not that, it's to basically meet the noise standards. and all the rest of it. And at the engine side of it, it's also to meet the emission standards, because you do not want fresh charge in your exhaust when it comes to emissions. That's a fucking game ender right there.
In this video, we're going to be talking about why exhaust back pressure is bad. We're also going to be talking about exhaust velocity and exhaust scavenging, which are both good. And so first we're going to start pretty basic, and then we're going to get into more complicated aspects of how exhausts work. So starting with the very basics, we have our engine here. It's got an intake, it's got an exhaust. The power stroke has just happened, so our piston is at bottom dead center, and we're about to press out all that exhaust, those spent combustion gases, once this exhaust valve opens. So within this chamber, pressure is about 6 to 7 times atmospheric. It could be more or less depending on the engine design. Of course, outside, pressure is atmospheric, so about 6 to 7 times as high inside the cylinder, and of course 1 atmosphere outside coming in your exhaust. Now, once this exhaust valve opens, of course, that high pressure is going to want to leave and go towards the lower pressure. And so we're going to define back pressure as pressure with the opposite direction of flow. So of course, as that valve opens, the high pressure in here wants to escape because there's lower pressure out here, so it moves out the exhaust. Now, back pressure would be resisting that. So we have atmospheric pressure outside of the exhaust. So one way to think about this, why back pressure is bad, take for example, if you were to lower atmospheric pressure extremely low. So now you have a vacuum out here. Well, now the pressure differential between outside and within your engine is even higher, so the exhaust is going to want to go out even faster. Now, the whole purpose of an exhaust is to evacuate those spent gases as quickly and as efficiently as possible. Now, if you were to take pressure that was way above atmospheric, let's say it was 10 times atmospheric pressure, well, now that's going to resist that exhaust coming out. So once that exhaust opens, if ambient pressure was 10 times what's inside here, you're actually going to have air flowing reverse. It's going to go the opposite direction. So you can see that as you increase back pressure, it does the opposite of what you want your exhaust to do, which is to evacuate and get rid of those exhaust fumes as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So back pressure is bad, it's not a good thing. So why do people say, well, you need some back pressure? Well, it's kind of misleading, and it has to do with exhaust velocity. So restrictions create back pressure. If you have a super restrictive exhaust that's a really narrow diameter exhaust, that's restrictive, that's going to have a lot of back pressure. It's also going to have a very high velocity because you're forcing all of those fumes out through a very tiny channel, so they're going to move very quickly. If you had a super large exhaust, you're not going to have much restriction, but consequently you're not going to have much velocity of your exhaust flow. So your exhaust is going to flow too slowly to escape out into the atmosphere. Ideal is somewhere in between. So a restriction causes a negative effect, which is back pressure, but it also causes a positive effect, which is high velocity. So you want some balance of velocity and minimal back pressure. Somewhere in the middle is that sweet spot where you have good exhaust flow, good speed to it, you have good scavenging characteristics, but however, you don't have too much back pressure, resisting that flow, resisting your exhaust escaping, meaning you would be making less power. A thing called inertial scavenging. And so if you think about like throwing a ball or a car driving, of course behind that car is a low pressure area because it's pushing the air out of the way. And the same thing happens with these exhaust gases. So when they open up and it sends out that high pressure exhaust pulse, that exhaust, that air has inertia to it because it's traveling at a very high speed. And so as it travels through the pipe, it creates a low pressure area behind it. So as it's traveling, it can start filling up this area with low pressure. And that's of course dependent on its velocity. And its velocity is also of course dependent on the piping diameter. So if it's too wide, it'll have a low velocity and it won't have that very low pressure area behind it. If it's too restrictive, you have too much back pressure, it's not allowing those exhaust gases to escape. And that's causing your engine to have to work harder to push out those exhaust gases. So, there's a sweet spot where you have the perfect amount of scavenging from both wave scavenging and from inertial scavenging, where this piping diameter and the piping length are both very critical in the performance of your engine for a specific RPM range. Of course, if you were to tune this incorrectly, if you were to have the wrong length, you can hurt the performance of it if you have this wave arrive at the incorrect time. It can actually be detrimental and cause you to have even less power than if you didn't do this at all. So timing is very important. Tubing length, tubing diameter, all very critical in how this system works and how you have that exhaust scavenging. So hopefully, this is a decent basic overview of how this all works, gives you an idea of why you don't want back pressure, but why you do want scavenging, and you do want exhaust velocity to help out with that scavenging.
Okay, so you made it this far. I know that's a lot to, it's a lot of different videos, a little bit long. And I know my videos tend to run long, but certain information needs to be presented with the right context, and you have to realize that an exhaust system, the science behind it and why it works and how it works, is actually quite complicated. In the end, you have to find the right size, the right system for your setup. Where you make the power and what your peak power is and all that is going to play into that. So that's kind of what this video is about. And I hope everybody watches, goes to these channels and subscribes and watches the videos, the whole video that I put in here, because there's a lot more information than what I presented here. I wanted to hit the highlights so that other people who watch my video will have a basic understanding, and they won't be coming on the internet saying some sort of stupid nonsense like they do, and won't be regurgitating this misinformation that is put out there about back pressure. I would go so far as to say that there is no such thing as back pressure. Just from that word that it's going back, that would be reversion, which is more than likely caused by a negative pressure somewhere inside the engine. It's not a pressure that's forcing itself back up the pipe. It is a resistance, I think, would be the best term to use. And there's a lot of factors, like velocity, scavenging, which was discussed in the video a lot, and another thing is heat. The hotter an exhaust gas is, or a hotter a gas is, the more volatile, the more active it's going to be, and the colder it is, the less active it's going to be. So if you're dumping your exhaust into some huge pipe, or it's dumping out atmosphere, some science and discussion about how long your pipe needs to be to achieve the effects that are discussed in this video. I'm not going into all that, but the point being, if you're just dumping something into atmosphere, it's going to cool down quickly. By comparison to 700-800 degrees, what's coming out of the exhaust, it's going to, quickly start turning into ambient, and it's going to slow down. And when it slows down, you lose velocity. And the key to exhaust tuning is velocity. And you have to understand that it's not a steady stream, that you have pulses going back and forth, as I've described in the video. So there's nothing to do about back pressure. It's an old wives' tale, and it's another lie that you've been told about so many things in this world. And I'm just really tired of hearing about it. So hopefully this helps. I'm going to promote this video. Please share it. Put it out there, and maybe that'll help other people watch the full videos on there and get an education. So yeah, that's all I got to say about that. Basically, stop saying stupid stuff in comments. Please, for the love of everything, stop it. You're wrong. It's not accurate. Yeah, so I'm just trying to stop some of these stupid comments that people have, and I'm sure it will never change. But I'm doing my part. Like and subscribe to my channel.